A gang of aggressive bikers targets a lone black woman, assuming she's an easy mark. What they don't realize is that she's not only tougher than she looks, but also a highly trained operative prepared to handle people like them. This story is a wake-up call against arrogance and prejudice. You won't want to miss it. Share where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more inspiring stories like this one. Now, let's dive in. That evening, cold winds carried the scent of dust and exhaust along the legendary Route 66. Amara, a black woman with a sturdy build and eyes as sharp as a blade, sat in her dust-covered truck, a vehicle that bore the marks of countless long journeys. Her gaze flickered briefly to the faded sign hanging over the window of a small diner. Earl's Diner. The letters on the sign were worn and dulled by time, as if the place had been frozen for decades. Amara pulled the handbrake, and the truck's engine groaned to a stop, leaving a silence that felt laden with anticipation. Her keen eyes swept over the surroundings, a habit she couldn't shake. An old gas station with rusting pumps stood forlorn nearby, and the gravel parking lot showed only faint traces of other vehicles. Reaching for her cap from the passenger seat, she adjusted it snugly on her head and pulled her jacket tighter against the chill before stepping out. Her boots crunched against the gravel with steady, deliberate steps, neither hurried nor hesitant. The glass door of the diner swung open with a faint jingle, but the sound was quickly swallowed by another force, the weight of an unusual silence. The moment she entered, everything seemed to pause. Amara could feel the stares. Behind the counter, a young waitress with her hair loosely tied in a bun froze mid-wipe, her hand still holding a glass. In the corner of the diner, near an old jukebox emitting a faint, raspy hum, sat a group of burly men clad in leather biker jackets. They had been leaning in close, laughing raucously, but their laughter abruptly died when she stepped in. These weren't mere curious glances. They were heavy, scrutinizing, and laced with hostility. No one greeted her. No polite nods, no friendly smiles. The air in the diner thickened, like a murky river churned up by her presence. But Amara wasn't surprised, nor was she unsettled. She'd seen this kind of reaction far too many times before. Like the calm before a storm, she thought, her face betraying nothing. She walked over to an empty table near the window, where the dim glow from a streetlight outside spilled faintly onto the surface. She always chose seats with her back never turned to the door, a deeply ingrained instinct from a life spent facing danger head-on. The chair scraped noisily as she sat, breaking the eerie stillness for a brief moment. She set her cap on the table, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing its brim. Yet her eyes missed nothing, not the people inside, not the subtle shifts in the bikers' postures, and not the uneasy energy simmering in the air. At the center table, one of the bikers, a hulking man with a bushy beard and tattoos snaking up his arms, leaned slightly toward his comrades, murmuring something. The group chuckled, but it wasn't a light-hearted sound. It carried a sharp edge, the kind of laughter that signaled mockery. Their eyes locked on Amara, as if she had unwittingly wandered into their den. Amara betrayed no reaction. She calmly picked up the menu, flipping through its worn pages as if the stares didn't exist. But she knew better than anyone. A storm was brewing, and it would only take a single spark to set it off. And she was ready. Amara gently flipped through the menu, her eyes skimming over the faded text as if entirely absorbed in the food options. Yet she could feel the weight of the stares behind her. These weren't merely curious glances. They carried an undercurrent of hostility, like a smoldering fire waiting for the right moment to ignite. At the central table, Jake, the leader of the biker gang, a hulking man with a thick beard that covered nearly half his face, leaned slightly toward his crew. His eyes swept over Amara like he was appraising a piece of merchandise that didn't belong in his territory. A smirk tugged at one corner of his mouth, but it wasn't a friendly one. It was pure disdain. "She looks like the type who got lost," Jake said, loud enough for his table to hear. He chuckled, leaning back in his chair, his leather jacket gleaming under the dim lights and accentuating the eagle tattoo on his arm. Next to him, Slim sat in stark contrast. He was gaunt and scruffy, with greasy hair plastered against his forehead. His shifty eyes darted toward Amara, laced with malice and a hint of mockery. Slim took a long drag from his cigarette, blowing the smoke in a deliberate cloud that seemed to aim right at her. "Maybe she thinks this is a city," Slim added, his voice low but dripping with venom, the kind of snide remark typical of someone content to stoke the fire from the sidelines. The others chuckled quietly, their laughter weaving into the already heavy atmosphere of the diner. Amara didn't need to turn around to know they were talking about her. She understood people like Jake and Slim all too well, men who thrived on the strength of their pack, using bravado and aggression to mask their inner insecurities. They sought out targets to feed their fragile egos, anyone they deemed weak or different. But they had chosen the wrong target. Amara set the menu down, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of the worn wooden table. With deliberate calm, she signaled for the waitress to come over. "A hamburger, fries, and black coffee," she said, her voice steady and clear without a trace of tremor. The waitress, Beth, nodded, but Amara noticed the slight tremble in her hands as she scribbled down the order. Beth's eyes flitted nervously toward Jake's table, a detail Amara didn't miss. Clearly, Beth knew this group, and she knew they were trouble. As Beth turned to leave, Amara could still sense the tension radiating from the counter, where the young woman kept casting worried glances her way. Amara didn't blame her. In situations like this, bystanders often found themselves trapped between fear and helplessness. At the central table, Jake's mocking didn't waver. His eyes stayed fixed on Amara as he leaned toward Slim again. "What do you think she is, huh? Some city slicker trying to act tough? Sitting there like she's someone important." Slim nodded in agreement, but this time his laugh lacked its earlier confidence. There was something different about Amara. The way she carried herself wasn't like the people they were used to intimidating. Her silence didn't feel like submission. It was more like a predator lying in wait, ready to strike at the right moment. But Jake didn't see it. He mistook her stillness for defiance, and Jake, like an old wolf, wasn't accustomed to being ignored. "Who do you think you are?" Jake's voice rose, loud enough to catch the attention of everyone in the diner. A few patrons sitting in the corners quickly ducked their heads as if trying to make themselves invisible. Amara still didn't respond. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting toward the window, her lips taking a slow sip from the cup of coffee that had just been placed in front of her. In that moment, she became acutely aware of everything: the scrape of chairs, the watchful eyes, the thick tension that had settled into the confined space of the diner. She wasn't afraid, she was just waiting. For Amara, people like Jake didn't need provoking. They would escalate things on their own, driven by their arrogance and need for a reaction, and when they didn't get one, they would push until they did. As she anticipated, Jake shoved his chair back and got to his feet. His heavy boots thudded against the wooden floor as he began walking toward her. A storm was coming, but this time she was ready to command it. Jake stopped, bracing one hand on Amara's table. His rugged beard cast a shadow over the steaming coffee cup in front of her. His narrowed eyes gleamed, part inquisitive, part provoking. The atmosphere in the cafe seemed to freeze. All the small, ambient sounds, the clinking of cutlery, the stirring of coffee, suddenly fell silent. "Look here," Jake said, his voice loud enough to carry not just to Amara, but the whole cafe. "We've got ourselves a stranger in town. Lost your way, have you?" His words stretched, deliberately emphasizing each syllable, as though intending to seed fear or shame. But Amara didn't turn. She lifted her coffee cup, sipped delicately, her gaze fixed out the window as though Jake were an insignificant ghost. Slim, seated nearby, seized the moment. He exhaled a puff of smoke into the air and smirked slyly. "Maybe she doesn't know we don't take kindly to outsiders around here." Slim drew out those last two words, his eyes flicking toward Amara's dark skin with blatant mockery. The laughter that followed from their table wasn't loud, but it carried enough malice to seep into every corner of the small room. Amara remained silent. She didn't respond. Her coffee cup clinked softly against the porcelain saucer, the sound crisp in the tense air, like a droplet falling into a pressurized void. Her eyes stayed trained on the outside world, where the setting sun cast long shadows over the empty highway. Her silence wasn't a sign of weakness. It was control. Jake, oblivious to the depth of that control, felt a sting to his ego. He wasn't used to being ignored, especially not by a woman. He slammed his fist lightly on the table, the sound making Beth, the waitress, jump behind the counter. "Who do you think you are, huh?" Jake growled, his eyes narrowing at Amara. "Strolling into this place without so much as a hello, acting like you're too good for anyone here." Slim chimed in, though his voice carried less confidence this time. "Or maybe she didn't hear us. Maybe we should speak a little louder." Still, Amara didn't look their way. She knew exactly how men like Jake and Slim operated. They craved attention for their words, and her calm demeanor, the silence they couldn't fathom, was unraveling them. She had measured every word, every movement. This wasn't her time to act. At the central table, another biker, Boone, grew restless. Boone wasn't one for excessive talk. He was a man of action. Towering and broad, with threatening tattoos sprawling down both arms, Boone furrowed his brow, slamming a fist onto his table hard enough to make his beer wobble precariously on the worn wood. "Jake, why are you wasting breath on her?" Boone grunted, his voice tinged with irritation. "We should show her how things work around here." Amara heard every word, every sound, but she remained steadfast, unmoved. Somehow, they reminded her of strayed dogs barking loudly to mask their inner fear. The only question that lingered: were they foolish enough to turn words into action? Jake leaned closer, gripping the edge of Amara's table as though staking his claim. "Did you hear me, huh? Or are you too high and mighty to talk to us?" He smirked, his eyes glinting with anger. Finally, Amara lifted her head. Her eyes, calm and deep as a still lake, locked onto Jake's. There was no fear in her gaze, no defiance. It was simply presence, enough to make Jake hesitate, if only for a heartbeat. "Yes, I heard you," Amara said, her voice low and steady. She lifted her coffee cup again, sipping before continuing. "I just didn't think what you said was worth answering." Her words were soft, but sharp as a blade, cutting straight through Jake's ego. He faltered, his silence lasting only a few seconds before fury replaced it. This wasn't provocation anymore. This was humiliation, and he couldn't stand for that. Slim snickered nervously, glancing at Jake, eager for his next move. Boone, meanwhile, squinted, readying himself to act if Jake gave the signal. The air in the cafe stretched taut, like a wire pulled to its breaking point. Jake straightened up abruptly, shoving his chair back with a loud screech. "All right, then," he said, his tone now icy. "Looks like someone needs a lesson in manners." He shot a glance at Boone and Slim, his expression unmistakable. And that's when Amara set her coffee cup down, stood slowly, and finally turned fully toward Jake, her gaze unflinching. The storm had arrived. And this time, Amara knew exactly what needed to be done. Jake did not tolerate disrespect. He took a deep breath, trying to suppress his anger, but his heavy hand slammed down on Amara's table with enough force to rattle the coffee cup on its porcelain saucer. "Who do you think you are to ignore me?" he growled, his voice low and sharp, carrying a menacing edge. Leaning in closer, Jake moved just near enough for Amara to feel his breath, reeking of cigarettes and stale beer. Behind him, his gang of bikers erupted in laughter. Not the kind of laughter that lightens a room, but the sort that bolsters the leader's dominance. Amara raised her head, unhurried, unafraid. Her eyes met Jake's, a cold, razor-sharp stare, like a blade freshly drawn from its sheath. In that instant, Jake didn't see an ordinary woman. He saw a threat, an enigma he couldn't comprehend. "I'm just here to have lunch. If you don't mind, go back to your table," she said evenly, her voice calm and steady. It sounded less like a warning and more like advice, but the very tranquility of her tone made Jake falter. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. No one had ever spoken to him like this, gently, yet with unshakable authority. Jake raised an eyebrow, unconsciously stepping back half a pace. Slim, seated at a table nearby, noticed this and quickly chimed in to break the silence. "Looks like she doesn't know who runs this place, Jake. Let me—" He rose, but a sharp gesture from Jake stopped him. Jake wasn't about to let anyone else intervene. Regaining his composure, Jake leaned in again, his presence once more imposing. "You don't get it, do you? This is our spot. People like you aren't welcome here." The words, "people like you," were emphasized, as though Jake wanted the message to stick not just with Amara, but with everyone else in the diner who was watching. Amara didn't flinch. Instead of replying, she placed both hands on the table, slowly intertwining her fingers. Her gaze remained steady, though now it carried an icy sharpness that sent an involuntary shiver down Jake's spine. She didn't speak, but her eyes seemed to assess his every move, ready to counter. At a corner of the diner, the waitress, Beth, held her breath. She glanced quickly at the counter where the phone sat unused, clearly debating whether to call the police. But Amara's subtle glance her way seemed to convey a silent message. "Don't. I've got this under control." "Come on, Jake, do something," Slim jeered, smirking. Boone, seated next to Slim, nodded in agreement. But Jake didn't respond immediately. A strange discomfort churned within him, a feeling he rarely experienced. Amara's silence was unlike anything he'd ever encountered. He was used to seeing fear in people's eyes, but all he saw now was unsettling composure. Jake chuckled, trying to mask his unease. "Fine. You want to sit there and eat your lunch? Go ahead. But don't forget, there's no one here to protect you." Straightening up, he turned away and walked back to his table, but his voice carried loud enough for the entire diner to hear. She thinks she's clever. Let's see how long she lasts." Amara didn't respond. She simply lifted her coffee cup, took a small sip, and set it down again. She understood that Jake's words were not the conclusion. They were the prelude to a larger confrontation. But she wasn't in a hurry. She was used to waiting, knowing full well that men like Jake couldn't stand being challenged. Sooner or later, he would act. And when he did, she would be ready. At the bikers' central table, laughter broke out again, but this time it sounded more forced. Boone exhaled a long puff of smoke, his eyes fixed on Amara as if trying to figure out who she really was. Slim leaned back in his chair, sneering but unable to hide the tension in his posture. Jake, now seated, waved a hand for Beth to bring more beer. But he hadn't let it go. His eyes never left Amara, watching her like a wolf stalking its prey, waiting for the right moment to strike. A wolf, unaware that it was about to face a tiger. Jake sat back at his table, but his pride was severely wounded. The faint chuckles from Slim and Boone, whether intentional or not, only added fuel to the fire. His voice came out low and gravelly, eyes fixed on Amara, but this time it was louder, clearer, as if he were reasserting his control. "You'd better stand up and leave, right now." He spoke slowly, each word stabbing through the air. The small diner fell eerily silent. A few patrons lowered their heads, avoiding eye contact, clearly unwilling to get involved. Behind the counter, Beth, the waitress, took a hesitant step back, gripping her dishcloth tightly. Her gaze darted nervously to her phone, but dared not pick it up. No one spoke. No one interfered. Amara remained seated. Her cup of coffee had grown cold, but her demeanor was as calm as when she first walked in. Jake mistook her silence for defiance, but for Amara it was simply patience, waiting for him to cross the line she already knew he would. Slim, sitting beside Jake, lost what little patience he had. He jumped to his feet, his chair tipping backward with a loud crash that echoed through the diner. Slim wasn't as tall or broad as Jake or Boone, but what he lacked in physical strength, he made up for in cowardice and aggression. "Let me teach her some respect," Slim declared, his voice brimming with misplaced confidence as if he had seized control of the situation. He stalked toward Amara's table, squinting his eyes and flexing his bony hands, his knuckles protruding sharply. "Didn't you hear?" Slim growled as he approached closer. "I said, stand. Up. Now." He reached out, aiming to grab Amara's shoulder. But before his fingers could touch her coat, Amara's eyes shifted. She looked up, deliberately and with precision. Her gaze, once serene, had turned as sharp as a blade. In that fleeting moment, Slim felt an unfamiliar chill creep down his spine, like he'd wandered into the territory of a predator far more dangerous than he'd realized. Yet his arrogance and bruised ego propelled him forward. Amara moved swiftly. With one hand, she gripped Slim's wrist, twisted it effortlessly, and yanked hard, throwing him off balance. He stumbled and crashed into the chair beside her, the heavy thud of his body landing punctuated by his elbow smacking the table's edge. He winced in pain. "Don't touch me." Her voice wasn't loud, but its steady, commanding tone felt like an unarguable decree. The entire diner held its breath. Jake and Boone leapt to their feet, their chairs scraping loudly against the wooden floor. Boone's fists clenched tightly, his face twisted in fury, while Jake glared at Amara, shock and anger battling for dominance in his expression. Slim, still nursing his arm, struggled to his feet, his face contorted with pain and humiliation as he glared at Amara. "You little—" he started, but Jake cut him off. "What did you just do?" Jake roared, his voice booming, slicing through the tense silence like a whip. "Who the hell do you think you are, putting your hands on one of my men?" Amara stood up for the first time since she entered the diner. She wasn't as tall as Jake or Boone, but her composure and unwavering gaze made them instinctively take half a step back. "I was defending myself," Amara said, her voice calm and measured, each word deliberate. "I told you, I'm just here for lunch. If you don't want this to escalate, go back to your table." Jake let out a bark of laughter, forced and mocking. He turned to Boone and Slim, laughing louder as if her words were the punchline of a joke. "Escalate?" Jake sneered, turning back to Amara. "You think you're in a position to say that?" He closed the distance between them, his posture exuding menace. Boone followed closely, his fists clenched tightly, ready to act on command. Amara sighed softly, so faint it was almost imperceptible. She had given them their chance, and they had squandered it. "If you want to try," she said, her voice carrying no malice, only a quiet resolve, "then go ahead." Her words weren't a challenge, they were an invitation, a final warning, but they didn't see it. Slim, emboldened by his bruised pride, shouted, "Do it, Jake! Show her who's boss!" Boone nodded in agreement, his face twisted with determination. Jake smirked, stepping closer, his hand reaching for Amara's collar. This time, Amara didn't wait. She was ready. Jake had taken another step forward, his massive arm reaching out to grab Amara's shoulder when she acted. Lightning fast, Amara seized Slim's wrist. The man still hadn't given up despite being taken down earlier, spun on her heel and pulled hard. The movement was fluid yet decisive, with enough force to completely throw Slim off balance. Thud! The sound of his body slamming against the floor echoed through the small room, shattering the tension like a taut string snapping. Slim writhed on the ground, groaning in pain, clutching his side. All eyes in the bar turned toward Amara. She didn't say a word, didn't make a single unnecessary move, but her stance and the sharp focus in her eyes shifted the entire dynamic of the room. Jake froze. He glanced at Slim sprawled on the floor, his face flushing red, a mix of anger and disbelief. He hadn't expected a woman to dare, and succeed, in humiliating one of his men right in front of him. Beside him, Boone furrowed his brows, his expression shifting from aggression to caution. But he didn't back down. Not yet. "What the hell did you just do?" Jake barked, his voice rising, attempting to dominate through sheer volume. But his outburst didn't faze Amara. She stood her ground, her unflinching gaze locked onto his, steady as a rock. Jake's fury boiled over, veins bulging in his neck. "Teach her a lesson," he bellowed. The command acted as a signal. Boone lunged forward, his boots thudding loudly against the wooden floor. The hulking man, arms inked with tattoos, aimed straight for Amara, his intention clear, to overpower her with brute strength. Jake stood behind, watching, his bloodshot eyes gleaming like a wolf ready to see its prey torn apart. But Boone never laid a finger on Amara. The moment his hand reached out, she stepped back half a stride, letting his arm swipe at thin air. Before he could regain his balance, Amara pivoted, lowered her center of gravity, and delivered a sweeping kick to Boone's knee. A dull thwack rang out, and Boone crumpled with a loud groan. Thud! Boone's massive body hit the floor with enough force to rattle the surrounding tables and chairs. The patrons in the bar held their breaths, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and astonishment. Beth, standing behind the counter, clasped her hands over her mouth, unable to believe what she was witnessing. Jake was losing control. "All of you, get her!" he roared. The remaining two bikers, who had been silent until now, stood up, trying to appear bold, but their eyes betrayed hesitation. They had just watched two of their comrades get taken down effortlessly. Slim was still groaning on the floor, and Boone hadn't even managed to stand up. Amara didn't flinch. She remained rooted in her spot, exuding an aura of calm readiness. One of the bikers charged, wielding a chair like a weapon. He let out a loud yell, perhaps to steel his own nerves, but his swing was clumsy and uncontrolled. Amara sidestepped effortlessly. Before he could recover, she grabbed the chair's handle and yanked it hard, throwing him off balance. Thud! A sharp knee to his gut sent him sprawling backward, clutching his stomach, gasping for air. The last biker hesitated, his eyes darting nervously between Amara and his downed comrades. Jake, still standing behind, shouted angrily, "Get in there! Don't let her humiliate us like this!" But the man simply shook his head, unwilling to move closer. His trembling gaze met Jake's, silently pleading to back down, but Jake only glared at him with utter disdain. "You're useless," Jake snarled before charging at Amara himself. Amara exhaled softly. She had hoped this wouldn't escalate further, but Jake had left her no choice. He swung his fist at her, aiming for her face with all the strength he could muster, but Amara wasn't afraid. She moved with the precision of flowing water, dodging his blow effortlessly. Before Jake could launch another attack, Amara was already in motion. A swift leg sweep sent him tumbling, his balance gone as he hit the floor hard. Before he could rise, she pinned his arm down, locking it firmly in place with just enough force to keep him from resisting. "I told you not to try," Amara said, her voice low and steady, like unyielding stone. Jake struggled beneath her, but her piercing gaze, cold and sharp, sapped the fight out of him. The bar fell silent. Everyone, from Beth behind the counter to the remaining patrons, stood frozen like statues, afraid to even breathe too loudly. The bikers lay scattered across the floor, groaning in pain, while Jake remained pinned beneath Amara's precise grip. She stared at him for a long moment, ensuring he fully grasped the reality of his situation. "This ends here, or it gets worse." Her words weren't a threat, they were an undeniable truth. Jake, his face red with anger and humiliation, finally stopped struggling. He realized he had lost. Jake lay sprawled on the floor, his breathing heavy, but his eyes still burned with anger and humiliation. He glared at Boone, silently commanding him to act. Boone, the towering biker with bulging muscles and tattoo-covered arms, gritted his teeth as he got back on his feet. He knew that if he didn't respond, the honor of the group and his own would be trampled. "You think you're that good, huh?" Boone growled, his fists clenched tightly, veins bulging on his forearms. He charged at Amara, his massive frame like a whirlwind, attempting to overpower her with sheer brute force. Swinging his arm with all his might, he aimed to deliver a devastating punch. But Amara didn't stand still. She moved like the wind, a quick step back, allowing her to evade Boone's punch. She didn't just dodge, she capitalized on his imbalance. With a swift pivot, she lowered her center of gravity and unleashed a powerful leg sweep against Boone's supporting leg. Thud! Boone crashed to the floor, his face slamming hard against the wooden surface, echoing like a boulder hitting the ground. He groaned, trying to rise, but Amara was faster. She stepped forward, deliberate yet swift, pressing her knee firmly into his back, pinning him down. "Don't move." Amara's voice was low, not loud but commanding, a tone Boone found impossible to resist. He struggled for a moment, then went limp, his heavy breaths the only sign of defiance. Slim, watching Boone's defeat, felt his blood boil. He wasn't as strong as Boone, but his desperation and recklessness made him dangerous in his own way. He grabbed a nearby chair, hoisting it high, and charged at Amara with a furious yell. Amara didn't need to look to know Slim was coming. The scraping of the chair against the floor and his hurried footsteps told her everything. As Slim swung the chair downward, Amara shifted to the side, effortlessly dodging the strike. The chair smashed into the floor, almost splitting in two under Slim's clumsy force. "Not quick enough," Amara murmured, just loud enough for Slim to hear. Before he could raise the chair again, Amara seized it, yanking it toward herself and throwing Slim off balance. He stumbled backward, trying to steady himself, but Amara was already in motion. Using the chair against him, she shoved it into his chest, sending him crashing into a nearby table. Glasses toppled and shattered, the room filled with the sound of breaking glass and thudding bodies. Slim lay sprawled amidst the wreckage, clutching his chest and gasping for air, his eyes wide with fear. Jake, witnessing his crew being taken down one by one, decided it was time to act. "We'll do this together," he barked, signaling to the two remaining bikers. They nodded, trying to mask their growing fear as they approached Amara. The three closed in on her, this time attempting a coordinated attack. One lunged from the left, aiming to grab her arm, while another targeted her legs, hoping to trip her. Jake held back, waiting for the right moment to land a decisive blow. But Amara wasn't one to be overwhelmed. She moved like a trained fighter, every motion precise and purposeful. The first man reached for her arm, but Amara spun, using his momentum to flip him over her shoulder. He hit the floor with a resounding thud, his head striking the edge of a table. He groaned in pain, unable to rise. The second man lunged at her from the right, but Amara was ready. She lifted her leg and delivered a sharp kick to his knee, forcing him to collapse instantly. Before he could recover, she stepped forward and shoved him onto his back, leaving him sprawled on the ground. Jake, seeing his men scattered around like fallen dominoes, let out a roar and charged. He swung a massive fist, aiming directly for Amara's face with all the strength he could muster. But this time, he didn't even come close. Amara moved with the precision of a dancer. She sidestepped his punch and, in one fluid motion, drove her elbow into his gut. Jake staggered back, gasping for breath as pain rippled through his body. Before he could regain his footing, Amara grabbed the front of his shirt and shoved him forcefully. He tumbled to the floor, lying there motionless, his breath ragged and labored. The room fell into complete silence. The patrons of the bar, including Beth, couldn't tear their eyes away from the scene. The bikers, once so menacing, were now scattered across the floor, defeated and powerless. Jake, who had once barked orders with authority, could only glare at Amara with a mix of anger and helplessness. Amara straightened, her gaze sweeping across the room. There was no anger in her eyes, no arrogance. She had simply done what needed to be done. "Is that enough?" she asked, her voice calm yet firm, resonating like a declaration. No one answered, because everyone knew. The question required no reply. The room was shrouded in silence. The heavy breathing of the bikers sprawled across the floor mingled with the sound of wind whistling through the cracked door. Boone, the largest of the group, braced his arms against the ground, struggling to rise after being taken down for the second time. But his knees trembled, his breaths were shallow, and his body crumpled the moment he tried to stand upright. Fear began to seep into the room. The others, some who had just been knocked down, others too hesitant to step forward, slowly realized this wasn't an ordinary brawl. They had gravely underestimated their opponent, and now it was too late to course correct. Every time their eyes flicked toward Amara, their initial bravado was replaced by an icy chill down their spines. Jake, the group's leader, lay curled on the floor, one large hand clutching his abdomen where Amara had landed a devastating blow. But he refused to accept defeat. The humiliation, the blow to his pride, and the defiance radiating from Amara wouldn't let him stay down. His teeth clenched as he forced himself to his knees, his eyes blazing with fury. "It's not over yet," Jake roared, his voice gravelly and echoing through the confined space. He lunged at Amara again, pouring every ounce of his remaining strength into a final, desperate attack. But Jake didn't realize his attack was futile. Amara stood poised and unshaken, as though she had anticipated his every move. When his fist hurtled toward her, she sidestepped with precision, ducked low, and used his own momentum to send him crashing to the ground. Thud! Jake hit the floor hard, his face flushing crimson, not with rage, but with shame. Before he could writhe or retaliate, Amara dropped down, pinning him to the ground. She locked his arm in a swift, calculated hold. Jake struggled, but her grip was unyielding, like iron shackles. She stared directly into his eyes, not with anger nor pity. "I told you to stop," she said, her voice steady and resolute, like a final verdict. This time, Jake didn't argue. His chest heaved as he gasped for air, his eyes now clouded with defeat. The diner reacted as if in slow motion. Beth, the waitress who had been frozen behind the counter, finally regained her composure. Her trembling hands reached for the phone, but before she could dial, Amara turned her head toward her. Her gaze softened but still carried an unexplainable authority. A small shake of her head was all it took to convey her message. Not necessary. Beth lowered the phone, her hands still unsteady. She had never witnessed anything like this before. A lone woman, not just standing up to, but overpowering a group of brutish bikers without a trace of hesitation. Beth couldn't take her eyes off Amara. In a corner of the diner, an older couple exchanged worried glances. The man, wearing a cowboy hat, shook his head slowly, realizing he had been wrong to think Amara was someone fragile who needed protecting. Meanwhile, the other patrons sat frozen in their seats, trying their best to disappear into the background, unwilling to be involved in whatever was unfolding. Amara finally released Jake's arm and rose to her feet with a swift but unhurried motion. Jake remained sprawled on the floor, gasping for air, his will to fight completely drained. Boone, Slim, and the others were too battered to even attempt standing. One by one, the bikers had been subdued. She stepped back, her gaze sweeping across the room. "I don't want this to go any further. Does anyone else feel like trying?" Her voice wasn't loud, but each word cut through the air like a razor. No one answered. Jake, still seething with resentment, avoided her gaze. Boone clenched his jaw, but the fear in his eyes betrayed the bravado he tried to maintain. Slim lay motionless, clutching his chest, too afraid to move. The room now belonged to Amara. The silence stretched on. Beth, summoning every ounce of courage, took a tentative step forward. Her voice was shaky but tinged with gratitude. Are you okay?" Amara turned to her, the sharpness in her eyes softening. "I'm fine." She nodded slightly, then glanced back at the bikers strewn across the floor. "And I think they'll be fine, too." Her words, though simple, carried immense weight. This wasn't a threat. This was closure. Jake lay sprawled on the floor, gasping for breath, his hands desperately gripping the edge of the table in a futile attempt to pull himself up. But his heavy, battered body betrayed his efforts. He turned his head, bloodshot eyes glaring at Amara, yet the look that once held authority and defiance was gone. Now it was saturated with helplessness and humiliation. Who are you?" he croaked, his voice hoarse from the physical and mental blow he had just endured. Amara looked down at him, her eyes cold and unwavering. She didn't rush to answer. Her silence seemed to press down on the room, making Jake's question hang heavier with each passing second. Finally, she tilted her head, her gaze piercing through him, not with anger, but with a calm resolve that felt even more formidable. "Just someone who knows how to defend herself," she said, her voice low and deliberate, each word landing like a nail driven into the air. "Don't try it again." Jake lifted his head, his eyes darting nervously, but he didn't dare say another word. The weight of Amara's statement needed no embellishment, no threats. It was powerful enough to extinguish any lingering defiance. The diner was dead silent. Not a single sound. The other patrons, unwilling witnesses to the confrontation, sat frozen, as if turned to stone. No one dared to move. A few sneaked glances at Amara from their tables, their eyes a mix of awe and disbelief. Beth, standing behind the counter, still clutched a dish towel, her trembling hands the only sign of the tension she had just endured. Amara's presence now felt like a mountain in the small room, unapproachable, immovable. Jake remained on the floor, his eyes darting around, desperately trying to salvage a shred of dignity from the ashes of his arrogance. Boone and Slim stayed motionless, clutching their injured limbs, panting heavily. Another biker, who had been silent throughout, now began to inch away, unwilling to meet Amara's gaze. Summoning her courage, Beth stepped out from behind the counter. Do you want me to call the police?" she asked, her voice trembling but filled with genuine concern. Amara turned to Beth, her expression softening slightly. "No need, they've learned their lesson." The statement wasn't just for Beth, it was aimed squarely at Jake and his gang. It wasn't a threat, it was a fact. Amara straightened up, her eyes scanning the room, locking briefly with each face. Jake lowered his head, his massive shoulders hunched as if the weight of humiliation pressed down on him. Boone closed his eyes, groaning in pain. Slim couldn't even muster the courage to look up. "If you want to leave here in one piece," Amara said, her voice steady and measured, "get up, walk out, and forget this ever happened." She didn't raise her voice, but the words struck like a hammer, breaking what little pride remained in the bikers. Jake didn't respond. He knew he had no other option. With a labored sigh, he began to push himself up inch by inch, as if even that small act required all the strength he had left. Boone and Slim, despite their injuries, started to drag themselves upright. One by one, they transformed from the brash aggressors they'd been when they entered the diner into defeated shadows of their former selves. The silence in the diner was oppressive now. The other patrons remained glued to their seats, not daring to speak or move. All eyes followed the bikers as they shuffled toward the door. Slim, who had been the spark for the earlier confrontation, now hobbled painfully, clutching his ribs. Boone limped awkwardly, his left hand pressed against his throbbing knee. Jake, the last to leave, glanced back, his eyes filled with bitterness. But he said nothing. The doorbell jingled as the door swung shut behind them. Amara returned to her table, quietly picking up her now-cold cup of coffee. She paid no attention to the stares still fixed on her. To her, it was just another episode in a life she had long since grown accustomed to. Beth lingered nearby, clearly wanting to say something but struggling to find the words. At last, she spoke in a hesitant voice. Do you need anything else?" Amara looked up, her expression now gentler. "No, thank you. I'm fine." Beth nodded, her lips parting as if to ask another question, but ultimately she stayed silent and retreated to the counter. Her eyes lingered on the woman who had turned what could have been a violent clash into a wordless lesson. The other patrons began murmuring among themselves. An elderly man in the corner shook his head. "Never seen anything like that in my life." A young woman whispered, "She's different, like something far beyond us." Amara heard it all, but she didn't react. She simply lifted her cup, took a small sip, and set it back down. Her eyes drifted to the window where the darkness of Route 66 was slowly swallowing the road outside. It was over, at least here for now. Outside the diner, the wind howled fiercely along Route 66, but the grunts and labored breaths of the biker gang drowned out even the gusts. Jake, still reeling from humiliation, struggled to his feet, leaning on Boone for balance. Boone winced, his face twisted in pain, while Slim staggered heavily, each step threatening to collapse beneath him. Eyes cast downward, their steps weighed by shame, none of them dared to glance back at the diner. Inside, the patrons remained silent, watching through the dusty window panes. Not a shred of sympathy lingered in their gazes, only contempt and quiet disappointment. Jake, desperate to salvage the last remnants of his pride, gritted his teeth and barked at his crew, "Hurry up! Are you all useless?" But his voice lacked its former menace. It rang hollow, frail, like a wolf without a pack, a leader stripped of power. Slim, usually the first to crack a joke, said nothing this time. He lowered his head, limping toward his motorcycle. Boone didn't bother acknowledging Jake, throwing him a disdainful look before walking away. The group's arrogance had been utterly shattered. None of them would follow Jake anymore. They knew he'd lost what had once made them fear him, his strength and dominance. Inside the diner, the atmosphere softened but remained thick with silence. Amara, seemingly indifferent to the chaos she had just quelled, returned to her table, pulled out her chair, and sat down. She lifted her coffee cup, taking a small sip. The bitter taste brushed her tongue, but it was nothing compared to the storms she had weathered in her life. Beth, standing behind the counter, stared at Amara for a long moment. Finally, summoning her courage, she walked over, her legs still trembling slightly. She stopped by Amara's table, hesitating. Who are you?" she stammered. Amara looked up, her gaze no longer sharp but soft, almost gentle. A faint smile played on her lips. "I'm just someone having lunch, that's all." Her answer was simple, yet laden with an air of mystery, as though she had no intention of elaborating. Beth didn't know how to respond. She lowered her head, feeling a tinge of embarrassment at her own curiosity, and quickly returned to the counter. Even in her safe spot, though, her eyes remained fixed on Amara. A quiet admiration began to bloom within her. The other patrons in the diner started stirring. A few whispered among themselves, their hushed tones unable to conceal their intrigue and awe. "Who do you think she is?" a man in a cowboy hat murmured, his voice filled with respect. "Never seen anyone like her before." "A normal person couldn't do that," a young woman in the corner whispered. "She's like a storm, powerful but completely in control." Amara heard their murmurs but said nothing. She simply sat there, silently finishing her meal. From time to time, her eyes drifted toward the window, where darkness was beginning to envelop the desolate road outside. The headlights of distant trucks flickered like stray stars against the somber sky. But to Amara, it was just another familiar scene, an endless road with no destination, where fleeting encounters left lasting marks. The biker's humiliation was nothing more than a lesson now. For Amara, the matter was closed. She neither sought gratitude nor expected admiration. To her, everything she did was simple, protecting herself and maintaining balance. The diner began to settle back into its usual rhythm. But for those who had witnessed the events of the day, they knew it would not be easily forgotten. Amara sat for a while longer, quietly finishing her lunch in silence. The gazes still followed her, but they no longer held suspicion or doubt. Instead, they carried admiration and awe. She placed her coffee cup down, her hands moving slowly as she dabbed her lips with a napkin, as if what had just transpired was nothing more than an everyday occurrence, not worth dwelling on. Before leaving, Amara reached into the pocket of her coat, pulled out a few bills and placed them neatly on the table. She stood up, her eyes briefly meeting Beth's, who was still standing behind the counter, her gaze a mix of reverence and curiosity. "Just someone who knows how to finish a meal," Amara said, her voice gentle yet firm, accompanied by a small smile, just enough to dissolve the lingering tension in the room. Amara walked away, her boots creating slow, steady footsteps on the wooden floor. Each step felt like the close of a chapter, while simultaneously opening a flood of thoughts for those who remained behind. She pushed open the diner door, the small bell chiming once more. A gust of cold wind swept in, carrying with it the atmosphere of the desolate Route 66 outside. Amara stepped out, not looking back. The door swung shut behind her, leaving a room full of people, yet empty in thought. Beth stood still for a long moment, her hand clutching the towel she'd been using to dry glasses. She stared at the closed door, as if struggling to believe the woman had actually just left. "I've never met anyone like her," Beth murmured, her voice as soft as a breeze. Her eyes followed Amara's retreating figure through the window, an image she knew would stay with her forever. Amara hadn't just left. She'd left a mark, a feeling that Beth had just witnessed something rare and extraordinary. In the corner of the diner, an older man wearing a cowboy hat nodded thoughtfully, his eyes filled with contemplation. "Someone like that. Most folks will never get the chance to meet," he said quietly to his companion. "I don't know who she is, but there's something about her. Something special." A young woman sitting nearby nodded in agreement, whispering, "She's not just strong. She's different. I don't think we'll ever forget her." Soft murmurs spread through the room, but no one dared to speak too loudly. It was as if any words spoken now would shatter the sacredness of the moment. Outside, Amara walked toward her truck. The crunch of her boots against the gravel blended with the sound of the wind rustling through the old gas pumps. She paused for a moment, her eyes flicking back toward the diner window, where the gazes inside still lingered on her. A barely perceptible nod, almost invisible, served as her final goodbye. She climbed into her truck and settled into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, breaking the silence of the open air. The tires turned slowly, grinding against the gravel and leaving tracks in the lot. Amara glanced once more at the diner's windows as she pulled away, never turning back. Inside, the silence remained. Beth set the towel down, her hands still trembling slightly. The remaining patrons exchanged glances as if searching for some explanation of what they'd just witnessed, but they all understood there would be no clear answers. Amara was not someone easily understood, and that was precisely what made her unforgettable. Outside, Amara's truck merged onto Route 66, leaving behind the faint glow of the diner's lights. She didn't think about what had just happened, didn't carry with her the faces or the stares from inside. To her, it was simply another moment in the journey, a fleeting encounter in a path with no fixed destination. But for those she left behind, this day would be remembered forever. Amara's old truck hummed steadily along Route 66, its headlights piercing through the darkness ahead. The scenery on either side blurred into the shadows, leaving behind the mile markers as silent companions. The engine's rhythm, like the heartbeat of the truck, synchronized with her steady breathing. She was in no rush. Amara never rushed. Her eyes were fixed on the road, but her mind wandered to a distant place, back to her days in the military, a completely different world where every action carried life or death consequences. Amara reminisced. She remembered the missions, the split-second decisions that defined outcomes. Memories of her comrades flashed by, their faces, a few filled with confidence, others with worry, and some she'd never see again. She recalled the times she had to protect them, even when they didn't realize the danger lurking close. Explosions thundered in her ears, sharp commands cut through the chaos, and the eerie silence after the battle left its own kind of scars. She thought of a young soldier, barely 20, who once looked at her with pure gratitude after she pulled him out of harm's way. He had asked, "How do you always stay so calm?" Amara had replied, "Calm is all we have when everything else turns to chaos." But now, looking back, she realized her answer wasn't entirely true. Calm wasn't just a tool, it was a choice, a deliberate decision to hold on to oneself when others might falter. The road ahead stretched endlessly, like the stream of thoughts in her mind. She knew she had left her military days behind, but the lessons from those years were etched deeply within her, like indelible marks on her soul. She recalled a scene in a diner, the angry stares from Jake and his group of bikers, their aggression and hostility. It didn't shake her composure. She didn't need anger, nor did she need to prove anything. All she did was remain calm and act when the moment called for it. Amara smiled faintly, a smile almost imperceptible in the dim glow of the dashboard. Strength isn't in striking, she thought, her eyes catching the distant flicker of lights from a gas station. It's in knowing when to stop. That was a lesson she had learned over the years, on battlefields, in life, and even in small, unassuming places like a roadside diner on Route 66. True strength wasn't about overpowering others. It was about control. It was about maintaining composure, even when everything around seemed to collapse. The truck slowed as she pulled into a small gas station. Amara stepped out, her boots crunching softly on the gravel. Her footsteps echoed in the quiet night as she walked inside, bought a bottle of water, and simply nodded when the young clerk asked, "Where are you headed?" "Just moving forward," Amara replied, saying nothing more. Back in the truck, she resumed her journey. The truck rolled out of the station and merged once more with the vast, open road where darkness enveloped everything but never left her feeling alone. For Amara, roads like these were where she found peace, not in the destination, but in the journey itself. The faint glow of the diner lights faded into the distance, but what had happened there left its mark, not just on those who witnessed it, but on her as well. Amara didn't seek to be remembered, yet she knew she wouldn't be forgotten. Route 66 stretched on, empty, yet full of freedom. Amara drove with a quiet confidence, carrying her calm demeanor, a silent pride, and the lesson she had spent a lifetime learning. Sometimes the greatest strength isn't in fighting. It's in holding on to peace, even amidst the storm. Amara's story wasn't just about physical strength, it was about inner strength, the ability to remain calm and composed in the most stressful of situations. Those qualities didn't just help her overcome challenges, but also left a profound lesson for anyone who witnessed them. What do you think of how Amara handled the situation in the diner? If you were in her place, would you have had the composure to do the same? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share to spread the message, and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring and powerful stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.